We turn to North Charlotte now, where a family is grieving and trying to wrap their minds around a shocking loss. A CMS teaching assistant faced a judge today on charges he shot and killed his wife inside their home.
Unsolved. Mystery. Truth. Headline uncovered.
Easter Sunday morning, Statesville, North Carolina. A woman stands at a pulpit in front of a full congregation. She is not reading from notes. She is not going through the motions. She is preaching, fully present, giving everything she has to every single person in that room. The sermon she delivered that morning was titled Emotions versus Maturity. She was talking about how you choose to respond when life gets hard. How you decide in the most difficult moments who you are going to be. The people in those seats received that message. They went home. They celebrated Easter with their families. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, their pastor was gone. Not from illness. Not from an accident. Not from anything that could have been predicted by anyone sitting in that church that morning. The person who ended her life was not a stranger. It was someone she had shared her home, her life, and more than 30 years with. Her name was Tammy McCollum. She was 58 years old. And this is her story. Before we go any further, this documentary covers domestic homicide and gun violence. If you or someone you know is in an unsafe situation right now, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That number is 1-800-799-7233. Please use it. Welcome to Headlines Uncovered. This is a channel built on one principle. The headline is never the full story. We go deeper than the news cycle. We follow the evidence, examine the facts, and stay with a case until the complete picture is on the table. This case is still developing. No trial date has been set. When new information surfaces and when this goes to court, we will be here covering every single development in full detail. Subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you do not miss a single update. And drop a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from. Now let us get into it. To understand what happened on the night of April 6th into the early morning hours of April 7th, 2026, you first need to understand who these two people were. Not just as names in a court document, but as real individuals who existed in real communities, with real people around them who knew them well. Tammy McCollum was 58 years old at the time of her death. She worked as a licensed cosmetologist and held a full-time position at Ulta Beauty in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. By every account from the people who worked alongside her, she was not simply a good employee. She was the kind of person whose presence in a room changed the atmosphere of it. A master stylist who worked beside her for years described her as one of the most kind, vibrant, and genuinely caring people he had ever encountered in his professional life. At least one colleague went further and called her the best employee Ulta had ever had. Those are not the words people use out of obligation. Those are the words people reach for when they are trying to describe someone who was genuinely irreplaceable. But Tammy's professional life did not begin and end at Ulta Beauty. She was also the pastor of the Well Worship Center in Statesville, North Carolina. And in that congregation, she was not a supporting figure or an occasional speaker. She was the primary voice, the leader, the person her congregation looked to every single week. Those who sat in her services described her preaching as personal, authentic, and fully committed. She did not phone it in. She gave every sermon everything she had. What stood out about Tammy, according to the people who knew her across both spaces, was that she brought the exact same level of investment to both roles. The same energy she brought to a styling chair at Ulta was the same energy she carried behind that pulpit. That consistency was not a performance. It was simply who she was. Eddie McCollum was 61 years old at the time of his arrest. He worked as a paraprofessional within the Charlotte Mecklenburg school system, assigned specifically to the Exceptional Children's Program at Southwest Middle School in Charlotte. That program exists to serve students who face developmental, behavioral, and learning differences. Young people who need the adults around them to show up with patience, consistency, and genuine care every single day. Eddie's role placed him in direct daily contact with some of the most vulnerable students in the district. His administrator, Principal Walter Clyern, ran Southwest Middle School and would later be the person responsible for communicating with school families in the aftermath of Eddie's arrest. By every available public measure, Eddie McCollum was steady and reliable. There are no public records of prior incidents, no documented domestic disturbance calls connected to his address, and no complaints of any kind that appear in the investigative record before this case. He and Tammy had been together for more than 30 years. 30 years of shared history, a shared home, and a shared life that, from the outside, carried no visible warning signs. That is the part that matters most as this story moves forward. Both Eddie and Tammy were visible, active members of their separate professional communities. Both were trusted. Both were, by all outward appearances, exactly who they presented themselves to be. The public record does not tell us what the inside of that marriage looked like. What it does tell us is that nothing on the surface suggested to anyone around them that something was deeply wrong. And that gap between what the world saw and what was happening behind closed doors is not unique to this case. It is one of the most consistently documented patterns in domestic violence research. But we will come back to that. Right now, what matters is understanding who Tammy McCollum was, because the events of Easter Sunday 2026 cannot be fully understood without knowing the woman at the center of them. Easter Sunday, April 6, 2026. The Well Worship Center in Statesville, North Carolina was filled that morning the way it always was on the most significant Sunday of the Christian calendar. People had come to celebrate. They had come to worship. And their pastor, Tammy McCollum, had come to preach. The sermon she delivered that morning was titled Emotions versus Maturity. It was not a light or surface-level message. She was speaking directly about one of the hardest things a person can be asked to do: to pause in the middle of a painful or overwhelming moment and choose a measured response over a reactive one. To decide, consciously, who you are going to be when the pressure is at its highest. The people in that congregation received that message on Easter morning and carried it home with them. After the service ended, Tammy did what she always did. She fulfilled her role, she poured into her congregation, and then she made the drive back to the home she shared with her husband on Cardington Court in Northwest Charlotte. What happened inside that house after she arrived has not been fully disclosed in any publicly available court document. What the record confirms is that at some point during those hours, a confrontation occurred. Court documents describe it as an argument. That is the only word the public record currently offers for what took place between Tammy McCollum and her husband that night. What the record also confirms is this. Just after 2 in the morning on April 7, 2026, Tammy McCollum was shot inside her home. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. She was 58 years old. The same woman who stood before her congregation that morning and talked about choosing maturity in the face of difficulty did not make it to Monday. And the person responsible was still inside the house when the sun came up. Sometime after 2 in the morning on April 7, 2026, a phone call came into the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department Dispatch Center. The caller was Eddie McCollum. He was calling from inside the home on Cardington Court. And he was not calling to report an intruder. He was not calling to ask for medical assistance for himself. He called to tell dispatchers that he had shot his wife during an argument. He told them where the firearm was. It was on the stairs inside the house. He gave them the address. And then he waited. That detail alone separates this case from many domestic homicide investigations. There was no flight. No attempt to stage the scene to look like something it was not. No cover story constructed in the minutes after the shooting. Eddie McCollum picked up the phone, reported what he had done, identified the location of the weapon, and stayed exactly where he was until officers arrived. When Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department officers reached Cardington Court, Eddie was present and cooperative. He spoke with responding officers at the scene. Tammy McCollum was found inside the home. She was pronounced dead at the scene. There was no ambiguity about what had happened and there was no question about who was responsible. CMPD confirmed publicly in the hours that followed that they were not looking for any additional suspects. This was not a home invasion. This was not a random act of violence. This was a domestic situation between two people who had shared that address for years. Eddie was transported to CMPD headquarters. He went without resistance. Once there, homicide detectives sat him down for a formal recorded interview. And in that room he told them the same thing he had already told dispatchers. That he and Tammy had argued. That he had shot her. The account he gave detectives matched the account he had given on the 911 call. He did not change his story. He did not try to reframe what had happened. He confirmed the same version of events twice, in 2 separate settings, to 2 separate groups of law enforcement personnel. At some point during that formal interview, Eddie McCollum invoked his right to counsel. He stopped speaking. And from that point forward, no further statements from Eddie McCollum entered the public record. What stood out to investigators was not simply the confession itself. It was the consistency and the composure behind it. He remembered where the gun was. He provided a coherent account on the phone and then repeated it clearly across a table from homicide detectives. He was not disoriented. He was not incoherent. That level of composure in the hours immediately following a shooting is something that does not go unnoticed in a homicide investigation. And by the time the city of Charlotte was waking up on the morning of April 7, 2026, Eddie McCollum was already inside the Mecklenburg County Jail. From the moment the shooting occurred to the moment he was in custody, the window was measured in hours. When the CMPD Homicide Unit took over the scene at Cardington Court in the early morning hours of April 7, 2026, they were not walking into a mystery. The suspect had already identified himself. He had already placed the call. He had already given 2 matching statements to 2 separate groups of law enforcement. Their job was not to figure out who did this. Their job was to build a case strong enough to take into a North Carolina courtroom and sustain a first-degree murder charge all the way through trial. And that is an entirely different kind of work. A confession alone does not get a prosecutor to a first-degree murder conviction. What it does is give investigators a starting point. Everything after that has to be independently verified, documented, and built into a legal framework that can hold up under scrutiny. That process started the moment forensic technicians stepped inside that house. The physical processing of the scene was systematic and thorough. Forensic technicians documented wound placement and conducted trajectory analysis to determine where both individuals were positioned at the time of the shooting and the direction in which shots were fired. Shell casing locations were carefully mapped and recorded. In any indoor shooting, the location of shell casings helps investigators reconstruct the sequence in which shots were fired and whether there was any movement between them. The firearm itself was recovered from the stairs inside the home, exactly where Eddie McCollum had told dispatchers it would be. That location was cross-referenced against his stated account of events. The interior of the residence was fully photographed and measured to establish spatial context for everything else the physical evidence revealed. Every single piece of that physical record was then held up against the account Eddie had already provided to determine where the two aligned and where, if anywhere, they did not. The charging affidavit that drove the formal decision to pursue first-degree murder was constructed from 2 primary sources. The first was Eddie's own statements, both the 911 call and the formal recorded interview conducted at CMPD headquarters. The second was what the physical evidence from the scene independently confirmed. That document became the legal foundation the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office used to move the case forward. Under North Carolina General Statute 14-17, first-degree murder is defined as a willful, deliberate, and premeditated killing. The charge signals clearly that the state is not prepared to treat what happened inside that house as an impulsive act that simply went too far. The legal significance of Tammy McCollum sustaining multiple gunshot wounds is something that needs to be understood in its proper context. This is not a detail raised for any reason other than its direct relevance to the legal standard the prosecution must meet. North Carolina courts have consistently held that the number of shots fired, combined with wound placement and trajectory analysis, can be used as evidence when establishing premeditation. The legal distinction here is straightforward. A single shot fired in the heat of a confrontation presents one set of legal questions. Multiple shots represent a sequence of separate actions, each one of which requires a decision to continue. That distinction sits directly at the center of what separates a second-degree murder charge from a first-degree murder charge under North Carolina law. And it is precisely the kind of physical evidence that investigators were documenting from the moment they entered that residence. For the prosecution to succeed on the first-degree murder charge, they must demonstrate 3 specific elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the killing was willful, meaning Eddie McCollum intended to cause Tammy's death. Second, that it was deliberate, meaning he was acting from a composed state of mind rather than in a moment of uncontrolled passion. Third, that it was premeditated, meaning he formed the intent to kill before the act itself occurred. North Carolina courts have ruled in previous cases that premeditation does not require extensive advanced planning. It can be formed in a matter of seconds. But it must still be demonstrated through evidence. It cannot simply be assumed. And that is exactly what the physical record from Cardington Court was being built to address. Beyond the immediate scene, investigators would have examined additional angles as part of a thorough homicide investigation. The prior incident history at the Cardington Court address would have been reviewed to determine whether any previous domestic disturbance calls had been made from that location. Witness accounts from neighbors, family members, and members of Tammy's congregation would have been sought to establish context about the state of the relationship. Digital evidence, including phone records and any communications between Eddie and Tammy in the hours leading up to the shooting, would have been a natural area of investigative focus. Financial records may also have been examined if investigators identified any potential motive connected to the couple's financial situation. None of this additional investigative material has been made available in the public record at the time this documentary was produced. What CMPD did confirm publicly was that no additional suspects were being sought. The investigation was focused entirely and exclusively on Eddie McCollum. While investigators were still processing the scene on Cardington Court and Eddie McCollum was being held at CMPD headquarters, the news of what had happened was beginning to reach the communities Tammy and Eddie had both been part of. And the response came quickly. Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools was the first institution to respond publicly. On the evening of April 6, 2026, Principal Walter Clyern of Southwest Middle School sent a direct communication to school families confirming that a staff member had been arrested. The message was clear and measured. It assured parents that the incident had no connection to the school or to any student. Eddie McCollum was placed on suspension with pay, which is standard protocol within the Charlotte Mecklenburg school system when a staff member becomes the subject of active legal proceedings. His colleagues and supervisors at Southwest Middle School had no documented concerns about his professional conduct. Nothing in his record at that school had raised any flags. The Well Worship Center in Statesville did not release an immediate public statement when media reached out on April 7th. That is not unusual. Faith communities move through grief differently than institutions that are accustomed to responding to news cycles. What it meant in practice was that the first wave of public tribute to Tammy came not from an official church statement but from the individuals who had known her personally. A master stylist who had worked alongside Tammy at Ulta Beauty for years described her as one of the most kind, vibrant, and caring people he had ever known and said directly that she deserved far better than what happened to her. At least one other colleague referred to her simply as the best employee Ulta had ever had. Members of the Well Worship Center congregation spoke about the mark she had left on their lives through her ministry and the way she had consistently made people around her feel genuinely valued. A digital content creator connected to her faith community addressed her death publicly, calling it a devastating loss and urging prayer for ministry leaders and people of faith around the world. CMPD Major Fishbach also addressed the public at the scene. His statement was directed specifically at domestic violence awareness. He made clear that resources were available for anyone currently in an unsafe situation and that help was accessible. His words carried a particular weight given what this case represented. A woman of faith, a leader in two separate professional communities, killed inside her own home by someone she had spent more than 3 decades of her life with. Less than 36 hours after Tammy McCollum was pronounced dead at the scene on Cardington Court, Eddie McCollum was standing before a judge at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. The legal process had moved quickly. A public defender was appointed to represent him. Bond was set at $1 million secured. Eddie did not post bond. He remained in custody at the Mecklenburg County Jail. The formal charge entered into the record was first-degree murder. That charge carries a specific and significant meaning under North Carolina law. Under North Carolina General Statute 14-17, first-degree murder is defined as a willful, deliberate, and premeditated killing. By filing that charge, the state of North Carolina was making a formal declaration that what happened inside that house on Cardington Court was not simply an argument that spiraled out of control in a single unplanned moment. The state was signaling its intention to argue that this was something more deliberate than that. Eddie had already admitted to pulling the trigger. He had done so twice, once on the 911 call and once across a table from homicide detectives. The act itself was not in dispute. What the prosecution now had to establish was the intent and the conditions surrounding it. The prosecution's path to a first-degree murder conviction will likely be built on several layers of evidence. The fact that Tammy sustained multiple gunshot wounds rather than a single shot will be central to the premeditation argument, for the legal reasons already established in the forensic record. The physical evidence from the scene, including wound placement, trajectory analysis, and shell casing locations, will support that argument. Eddie's own recorded statements, both the 911 call and the formal detective interview, will be part of the evidentiary foundation. Any additional witness accounts or digital evidence compiled during the investigation will also factor into what the prosecution presents when this case goes to trial. On the defense side, Eddie McCollum's appointed public defender had not made any public statement regarding strategy or approach at the time this documentary was produced. The defense team will have full access to the charging affidavit, all forensic reports from the scene, Eddie's recorded statements, and any additional investigative material the state has compiled. Pretrial proceedings will give both sides time to review the full scope of the evidence before any trial date is set. And as of the time of this documentary, no trial date has been set. What that means in practical terms is that Tammy McCollum's family is at the very beginning of what will likely be a long and difficult legal process. First-degree murder cases in North Carolina routinely move through months and sometimes years of pretrial proceedings before they ever reach a courtroom for trial. Every hearing scheduled, every motion filed, and every piece of evidence presented will represent another step in a process that is far from over. We are about to get into the most critical open questions in this case, the details that remain unanswered and that will define everything when this finally goes to trial. If you have been watching this far and you are not yet subscribed, now is the moment to do it. Headlines Uncovered covers every development on cases like this one, from the first hearing all the way through to the final verdict. Hit subscribe and the notification bell right now. You do not want to miss what comes next in this case. There is a significant amount that the public record has not yet told us about this case. And it is important to be honest about that rather than fill the gaps with speculation. The motive has not been publicly established. Court documents reference an argument between Eddie and Tammy on the night of April 6th into the early morning of April 7th. That is the extent of what the public record currently offers. What that argument was about, whether it was an isolated incident or the surface of something that had been building inside that marriage for a much longer period of time, has not been disclosed by investigators or the district attorney's office. Eddie McCollum's defense strategy has not been made public. His appointed attorney has not spoken. Whether any incidents occurred within that marriage prior to that night that went unreported remains unknown from the available record. Any digital evidence, including phone records or communications from the hours before the shooting, has not been referenced in any publicly released materials. And what Tammy's family has shared privately about their experience and about the marriage has not entered the public record. What the record does confirm is that there were no prior documented domestic disturbance calls to the Cardington court address and no history of violence appears anywhere in the released investigative or court documents connected to this case. That fact is consistent with a pattern that researchers and advocates have documented extensively at a national level. The National Domestic Violence Hotline and the Bureau of Justice Statistics have both produced data showing that a significant percentage of domestic violence situations go entirely unreported until a fatal incident forces them into public view. Domestic violence does not always leave a paper trail. It does not always produce police reports or visible warning signs in the spaces where victims are most seen. Tammy McCollum was active, present, and celebrated in two separate professional communities. Whatever was happening behind the door of that house on Cardington Court did not surface in either of those spaces until it was too late. Tammy McCollum was a pastor, a licensed cosmetologist, a colleague, and a wife. She spent her professional life and her calling doing the same thing in two different rooms, showing up fully for the people around her. On the last morning of her life, she stood before her congregation and delivered a sermon about choosing maturity over emotion when circumstances become difficult. That message is now the last public record of her voice. The congregation at the Well Worship Center carries it forward. The colleagues she worked alongside at Ulta Beauty carry the memory of who she was every time they walked through those doors. She deserved to come home safely that night. She deserved to see what her people did with that final message. And she deserves the full truth on record. No trial date has been set. Pretrial proceedings are continuing in Mecklenburg County. As hearings are scheduled, as motions are filed, and as evidence is formally presented, more of the truth about what happened inside that house will come to light. When this case goes to trial, and it will, Headlines Uncovered will cover every hearing, every piece of evidence, and every significant development from the courtroom. This is the kind of case that does not end at an arrest. The most important chapters of this story are still ahead. Subscribe right now, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment below telling us what question you most want answered as this case moves forward. We read every single comment. Every one. This has been Headlines Uncovered. The story is not over, and neither are we.